AI Mentors is brought to you by Alldus International, covering your business's staffing, consulting, and networking needs. Our podcast, AI Mentors, hosted by Mark Kelly, brings you the leading minds in AI, sharing their story, their success, and their advice. Focusing on fast-tracking you to the top, AI Mentors cuts through the hype to help you kickstart your data science career.
Welcome to the AI Mentors podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kelly, Chief Customer Officer at Alldus International. In today's podcast, we welcome Ian Macomber. Ian leads the analytics at Drizly, which consists of BI, data science, and data engineering. He previously worked at Wayfair on the recommendation algorithms and pricing models, where he got his start as a BI analyst. Ian received an MBA from Harvard Business School and a BA in mathematics from Dartmouth College. And on weekends, Ian volunteers for Youth Enrichment Services in Boston, where he's a board member. Ian, very welcome to the show today.
Mark, thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about life at Drizly. What's like working there at USP, and maybe some of the interesting facts kind of happening around the US at the moment, particularly with COVID and the impact of Drizly. I'm sure there's probably lots to think about in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So Drizly is the world's largest alcohol marketplace. So, somewhat similar to the business model of Grubhub, Uber Eats, and Postmates. We do not actually, hold the alcohol or own the alcohol. We connect you with your local liquor store. So we have, a pretty similar two-sided marketplace where we have to find liquor stores, sign them up. They either provide their own drivers, so sort of the early Grubhub model, or we enable them to call a courier like Postmates or DoorDash. So the key thing there is it's sort of very capital light in nature, mostly corporate employees in customer service in Boston and Denver, as opposed to hiring all the drivers ourselves. The somewhat interesting piece about Drizly specifically is that unlike, a restaurant who is connecting customers with entrees who are, generally generic and one-off, and by that I sort of mean, chicken lo mein at one restaurant is not inherently the same as chicken lo mein at another restaurant. For us, those entrees would sort of be SKUs produced by Miller Coors or InBev or Diageo or Constellation or many of these other groups who care sort of vehemently about which ones they sell. So in that way, we would actually consider ourselves to be a little bit more of a three-sided marketplace where we're working with manufacturers of alcohol, retailers who are the local liquor stores, as well as the customers. So somewhat similar to Uber, we have a consumer app for iOS and Android, a consumer web interface, but we also have a retailer app for iOS and Android, as well as sort of a retailer website. And then finally, we have a portal where suppliers can go in to manage how their own products appear on the site. So a little bit different than sort of the generic delivery services, but pretty cool restaurant. And like I said, biggest alcohol marketplace in the world.
Tell us what COVID, the type of impact it's had, because it's not like you can kind of wander down to your local off license to pick up a six-pack anymore. It's quite a bit of change around that, pretty much all around the world. And how have you guys adapted to that and the change within your business model?
So COVID has definitely been, a demand shock for us. So Drizly, we would historically say has been a demand-constrained marketplace in that, generally we sign stores up and their biggest complaint was we're not doing enough business. I hired a driver and he or she isn't doing enough orders today. So as a result, our strategy for signing up stores was a lot more, let's build around the edges. So for example, looking at graphs of where customers didn't have Drizly coverage, making sure we were putting stores there and sort of expanding out into the suburbs in a lot of our major metros. The onset of COVID flipped the script entirely for us, where we were getting, something like we've had hundreds of thousands of new buyers. And what it's led to is us sort of really realizing that we don't actually have the capacity in our core markets to process that number of orders. So historically, we wouldn't have necessarily gone out of our way to outbound sign up a new store in Manhattan because we had enough stores in Manhattan. But for the first time, we sort of realized we don't have enough stores in Manhattan to do the levels of orders, for example, that happened during COVID. And then I think sort of the same question starts to boil down from the store level to driver level about thinking, for example, if we're going to do 5x the orders, increasingly, I think we've learned that you can't expect necessarily every store to do 5x the orders, where, if you're sort of a bodega that doesn't have parking spots, it's just sort of unreasonable to hire, 5 more drivers if you're fulfilling online. And sort of the stores aren't necessarily set up for it to begin with. So I would say that's kind of been one of the big questions for us, is where do we go coming out of here? We know that the customer is more trained to know that alcohol is online. The stores are definitely sort of more helpful and willing partners, because instead of a small peripheral part of their business, Drizly is suddenly pretty meaningful. So it's a very cool strategic time for us. But the other thing I would say about COVID, and this is obviously a delicate subject because it's sort of so tough for the entire world, but we're pretty proud of Drizly's ability to keep business flowing for a lot of these stores that otherwise would have a really, really hard time economically. So Drizly has employed something like 1,200 additional drivers, brought lots of stores online, had something like 140,000 individual driver days, paid something like $8 million in taxes and $10 million in tips. So obviously, there are people doing work that's substantially more important than us, but we are sort of proud to the extent that we've been able to keep small business, mom and pop liquor stores online, and convert a lot of them online pretty quickly during these tough times for the economy.
Yeah, they're really, really good stats to share, and that's very, very helpful. Tell us a little about your career today, some of the work that you've done in the past, maybe in Wayfair, and then maybe speak a little about your education and try to kind of develop different skill sets and probably your rationale to kind of getting a MBA.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I joined Wayfair, I was 22. It's very, very classic business intelligence education where you sort of come in, learn the ropes with SQL, and then also what I would almost call sort of industry standard development as opposed to academic standard development, where you learn how to work on a code base sort of run by 40 other people. So I had incredible mentors at Wayfair where I really learned all the tools of a modern tech stack. And after about a year on the BI team, it was somewhat inbound in nature. And by that, I sort of mean the BI team sort of at that time had an internal consulting function where I didn't necessarily have a ton of control over what I was working on. And I really liked a lot of the work I was doing for the pricing team. So I ended up requesting an internal transfer and stayed on the pricing team, which sort of then developed into the pricing algorithms team for about 3 years. And what we were doing at the start was really different at the end. So at the start, we were basically sort of saying, Wayfair's current sofa page has prices that are set by the category manager for sofas, who negotiates these prices and cost of goods all day long with sofa manufacturers. And we recommend sofas to you based on the category manager's intuition. And obviously, in 2020, all of those things are algorithms constructed by massive teams of PhDs. But at the time, the question was sort of, how do we start building out process and algorithm to take decisions made by a human and sort of convert them to a more standardized team for the first time? And the reason we needed to do it for Wayfair was obviously both a combination of efficiency and just the fact that if you have pricing that's sort of done by hundreds of people not talking to each other, first of all, it's not necessarily reproducible. And second of all, you just can't give any guidance whatsoever for hitting profit margins because the sofa person is setting prices somewhat independently of, the rugs person. And my last sort of 2 years there, we were working entirely on recommendation algorithms. And I'll get into it a little bit for Drizly, but one of the big differences in my mind between the two companies is for Wayfair, the easiest thing to predict someone wouldn't order again is what they already had ordered. So for example, if you're going to buy a sofa, we're not going to recommend you a sofa. If you buy a desk, we should recommend that you buy a desk chair or a desk lamp. For Drizly, it's completely different, where the thing someone's most likely to purchase is what they've already purchased. So the recommendation algorithm is a lot easier. So I would say my last sort of year at Wayfair, we were working on this really niche problem, right? Which was recommendation. And it was really cool because, we got to deep dive on it and look at what Spotify and Netflix and Google and Amazon were doing, read their white papers, try to implement, frankly, sort of PhD style or level thoughts of thinking and code around it. But I think where I was potentially looking for a little bit more was the fact that this was truly a problem that was never ending. You could put your headphones on, put your head down and work on recommendations for a year, because if you made a 0.1% improvement on $1 billion revenue base, it was clearly worth it to have you as an employee. So I think I sort of picked my head up a little bit and said, I don't necessarily know if I want to go super deep and just sort of be recommendations for the rest of my life and not really know what's going on with supply chain and logistics and sales and account management and customer service and ops and things like that. And that's ultimately why I ended up sort of deciding to go attend business school.
Tell us about the importance of solving the problem that's keeping the CEO up at night. And maybe some data scientists coming into the world or the business world don't necessarily think about that, but they think about more about the models, but don't necessarily think about what's the real problem that needs to be solved. And what kind of got you around that kind of way of thinking?
I guess first I would sort of say, in that previous example of working on a recommendation algorithm indefinitely, it doesn't really train you to ask the question, is this the most important thing I can be working on right now? And potentially even a little bit more importantly, it doesn't force you to ask the question, when should I stop working on this? When should I work on something else? So you're sort of a CEO, you're constantly thinking about, how can I apply the limited amounts of resources that I have to the maximum amount of problem? And, another thing that I would sort of say about my time at Wayfair versus time at Drizly is Wayfair sort of had, these third-time founders that really kind of had their roadmap laid out of where they wanted to go and just executed on it, versus Drizly, it's one where, frankly, we're in a industry with a lot more players that's moving really quickly, and we're a small fish, sort of compared to the Uber Eats of the world, the Postmates and Grubhub and DoorDash of the world, but also sort of the Miller Coors, Anheuser-Busch, and Diageo. So frankly, we have to iterate, change our business plan, change our strategy a lot more than that. And that's something that I think, if you have strictly let me figure out how to tune the hyperparameters on this model to get an additional 0.5% out, it's hard for you to realize sort of what the actual problems that you need to work on are for the business. And when I think about sort of working on the problems that keep the CEO up at night, and potentially where an MBA style background helps, I would say that right now, for Drizly specifically, we're a Series C company that might eventually raise a Series D. And when you're thinking about that, you have to think, what do the Series D investors need to believe in this company for them to invest at sort of favorable equity terms? And then you kind of have to reverse engineer that to sort of say, what does our CEO need to prove about the company to these people that hasn't been done yet? And that's the type of thing that might keep the CEO up at night. And that's one where I think you can sort of say, not only can I work on a problem indefinitely and make it better, but I can take my head up, look at sort of the selection set of existing problems. And, a phrase I use with my team quite a bit is figure out how to source your own problem. So don't sort of say, I'm going to wait for the tickets to come inbound and then operate on a cadence of sort of doing as many JIRA tickets as possible. Work on the hard thing, work on the thing that keeps the CEO up at night, work at the thing that you need to be able to solve for your business to work successfully. And then most importantly, like I said, figure out when you're done and figure out when you can move on to the next thing. Because if you're on an analytics team that has limited resources, it's your job to know that too.
I think it's a fantastic mindset to have. And if all employees had that, we'd have extremely efficient and productive and impactful data science teams. So really, really good advice there, Ian. Tell us a little bit about build versus buy, and particularly for a smaller company competing against some of the larger companies. How important is it to maybe buy the service rather than build the service, where sometimes maybe you should build versus buy? And it's sometimes people don't necessarily think about the impact of making a decision like that.
So build versus buy. So I think first of all, I can definitely say this is a question that someone could spend a lifetime on from an organizational perspective, and sort of figuring out both what to build initially, what to buy initially, and flip the switch. I don't think anyone has all the answers here, but I can potentially give you a couple of examples and show you how my perspective's changed on this. And I think, frankly, build versus buy is something that 1 year of working at a startup has really sort of changed my thinking on. So first, I'll say, Wayfair was very much a company founded by engineers who hired engineers, where the culture was, let's find people who know how to write code and teach them about ops, teach them about product, teach them about marketing. So how this played out was, when I was there, Wayfair had their own CRM tool, their own Jira tracker, managed all of their own servers. And I think largely this has led to a lot of their success. They figured out things like, really complex third-party delivery logistics, less than parcel shipping, figuring out how to have, all of the furniture in the world and sort of stuff it into a single proprietary catalog management system for suppliers, the pricing algorithms and recommendation algorithms that are specific to furniture. That stuff's really core to Wayfair. But I would say some areas where I think they've sort of pretty famously been late to are, they were super late to the cloud. And I think it's because they had, a pretty big team of data engineers who owned the raw metal and managed the Hadoop installations and didn't necessarily use, Cloudera or Hortonworks because they built it themselves. They, had a project called Warp where they built a visualization layer somewhat similar to Tableau. And I think that's just kind of one where, looking at it now, it's like, is it really going to be a core competency of this company that they develop their own sort of in-house visualization layer? So compare this to Drizly, where I came in on my first day, and frankly, I was pretty shocked at how much stuff we outsourced. So for example, we used Iterable as a CRM tool, and used agencies to do some of our work, as opposed to kind of like building a photo studio, for example. And sort of all sorts of things like that, both internally, and then obviously from a tech side, we entirely run on AWS. So cloud first, using just sort of the standard AWS toolkit, as opposed to building all this stuff in-house. And where I think my perspective has changed is, there's a great podcast with Zach Canner where he makes the recommendation, code is not an asset, code is liability. And what that means is, if you're going to build something, you not only have to commit to building it, you really have to commit to building it in perpetuity, and sort of supporting it in perpetuity. And so an example of a decision we made around this was, Drizly uses quite a few third-party sources, same ones as every startup. So we have Zendesk and Google Ads and Facebook Ads and Salesforce. And when I joined, we had a data engineer who was building custom API integrations for all of those to get our data out. And, we kind of thought to ourselves, this person is a full-time hire, this is their full-time job. But ultimately, that's not really a problem that's core to Drizly. Drizly's core problems, I would say, are figuring out how to digitize the entire shelf, figuring out how alcohol consumers, how alcohol e-commerce is different for consumers, figuring out how to map latitude and longitudes onto delivery polygons, onto inventory mappings, onto all of the local and state regulations to answer these questions for the first time about what type of alcohol is legal or not. Getting data out of Google Ads and Salesforce into sort of our data warehouse is not really a core competency of Drizly. And it is a problem that sort of thousands of other startups have. So this is one where, for example, we ended up choosing Fivetran and then also sort of supplementing with Stitch data to solve this problem for us. And now our data engineering team works strictly on problems that we can't outsource, that are our core competencies. So balance of build versus buy, I think increasingly as you get bigger, maybe it changes. You need more bespoke solutions for us. Right now, for example, maybe that's customer service, where something out of the box might not work when you start to have 60 customer service members instead of 25 due to COVID. You might have to think, how do I invest in sort of proprietary, product to support these people. But I think pretty largely, you do kind of have to have your head up and think, is it crucial that I solve this problem? Or, for example, can I enlist something like Stripe, which famously rolls out new tools and services all the time, or AWS, where the price famously keeps getting lower? And can I just assume that the success in this part of my business will compound faster outside of my four walls than inside, which I think is pretty core to making these decisions.
Ian, that's really, really good thought process. And it changes all the time depending on the problems your company's working through and also the size of your company as well. So I think it's well thought out. And my final question today, what advice would you offer to data scientists coming into the field and from maybe some of the learnings you've had over the years?
Absolutely. So I think I have maybe two separate pieces that kind of go opposite directions. The first is learning how to learn. So I know that this is sort of like pretty generic advice, but I would sort of say my first year at Wayfair, I kind of waited for people to tell me how to do things. And I think the moment the light switch went off for me is I had someone who's hired in my cohort, started on my same day, and we made the switch from Netezza to Vertica. So two kind of massive clickstream style database processing, columnar store databases. And when we did that, I kind of largely waited for someone to tell me how Vertica worked. And this guy sort of found the Vertica docs, went in, read 550 pages of documentation, and ended up being the Vertica expert sort of at 23 years old and, with sort of 3 weeks more experience than me reading these Vertica docs. And it just didn't occur to me that you could sort of go do that, go read the documentation for something and become your company's expert on something. So, within 3 weeks, this person sort of goes from being a generic BI analyst to a completely indisposable part of the system's infrastructure. And he's sort of continued to ride that wave and now leads, a pretty big infrastructure group at Drizly. And I'd say that's sort of always true. Assume that your company always needs to develop external knowledge that's out there and bring it in-house, and that nothing's stopping you from doing it. And I think the best analysts that I've seen, the best data scientists I've seen, constantly have that mindset where they sort of say, there is external knowledge out there. It's a super collaborative community. I'm going to go get it, bring it in-house, and then teach other people how to do things. So I'd say that's a big piece. And then I'd sort of say the second piece that I'd touch on is understanding the difference between academic style data scientists and industry style data scientists. And this is sort of like a overgeneralization, but I'd say in academia, it's much more common that you get a correct CSV, you build a model for it that predicts labels or targets or outputs for your CSV, and you're done. That's your assignment. In reality, you're so much more often building pipelines of data and figuring out how to build systems that fail elegantly instead of silently when they see new data, and measuring drift of models over time. And I would potentially say, most importantly, you are not working on your own MacBook Pro. You are working on a team with, maybe 4, maybe 100, maybe 1,000 other people in this code base. So you need to figure out how to develop relative to that and sort of learn those tools, which I think, frankly, are not that well covered in academia. So I'd sort of say those are my two pieces of advice. Learn how to learn, and then sort of secondarily, figure out how to build pipelines and sort of collaborate on a team, as opposed to just doing kind of work on your own MacBook Pro.
You've been listening to the AI Mentors podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kelly. Today's guest has been Ian Macomber. Ian leads the analytics at Drizly, which consists of BI, data science, and data engineering. Ian, thank you very much for your time today.
Mark, thanks for having me.
Get the Alldus advantage. Become a member of the Alldus community and enjoy some of the following: AI meetups. Once a month, our community gathers to listen to some of the leading experts in the world of data science and AI. Our speakers come from all over the world, including Dublin, Boston, and Frankfurt. We also have our AI mentors. Our experts will provide mentoring to Alldus members. And don't forget our AI in Action podcast. Each week we have guests from all over the world talking us through their education, career, and more. Become an Alldus member and get the Alldus advantage. For more information and to sign up for our newsletter, log on to www.alldus.com. That's www.alldus.com. Alldus International, empowering through AI.